Wow, so if you haven't noticed, things have been really heating up in Canada, and I'm not just talking about the wildfires. There's been a number of politicians that have been fired just last week in an attempt to give the government a little bit of a new look. Now, these new faces can have a huge impact on every single Canadian if they choose to change certain regulations and laws. And this applies everywhere, but no part of Canadian living needs a facelift more than the housing issue. Not only do we have most Canadians giving up on ever owning a home at all, but we also have a huge rental price issue, and more encampments like this one are popping up due to the insane cost of living. But any credibility that the government might have gained by firing the housing minister and replacing him, well, they've just lost it after a clip from a recent press conference went viral just yesterday. And trust me, if you haven't seen this, you need to see it. Take a look at this clip and then we'll break down exactly what's going on.
Right now, we're facing a real challenge around housing in terms of supply. There's simply not enough places for people to live right across the lower and middle income spectrum. And I'll be blunt as well. Housing isn't a primary federal responsibility. It's not something that we have direct carriage of, but it is something that we can and must help with.
Now, some people have been sharing a shorter version of this clip that just shows the Prime Minister saying, hey, housing isn't our responsibility, without the follow-up context that you just heard saying that the federal government does have a role to play, does need to help. But regardless of this context, I still think it's absolutely insane that he said this out loud. And he's absolutely right that housing falls under each province's responsibility, but seeing that the provinces aren't getting anywhere and not recognizing that drastic countrywide action needs to be taken is baffling to me.
So from the time we got elected in 2015, we were committed to building a national housing strategy, which we announced in 2017, and in continuing to be there to layer in and show up. But you're right. It's not just the federal government that can solve this.
How serious you actually are about an issue isn't measured by how much money you throw at it or how many strategies are devised about that issue. I think that the real measure is results, and many Canadians aren't convinced that keeping to the status quo of this current government is going to get them any results of any kind. And this whole thing seems to be a response to the nerve that Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition party, the Conservatives, has struck with Canadians, especially Canadians between the ages of 20 and 40, people who are very pissed off about the housing situation. Canadians know that things have gotten way worse over the past decade, and Pierre Poilievre has leveraged that in a major way. And this seems to have put the federal government on the defensive, saying what sounds to Canadians like, housing isn't our problem, don't look at us, look at your provinces and municipalities, your towns, they're the ones that you should be mad at because they have control over this. And like I said, the provinces and the cities are responsible for creating more housing supply, but the element of the equation that seems to be conveniently left out here is that it's mostly countrywide federal policy, which is creating the insane amounts of demand for housing, which is the root cause for the imbalance between supply and demand. It's not only supply, there's a demand side to it too. Sure, it's a provincial problem that needs to be handled by provinces and cities, but it's a problem that largely has been caused by countrywide issues, countrywide policy. Think about the federal government. Even though they aren't involved in the day-to-day operations of it, they are in control of the CMHC, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Commission, the largest mortgage insurer in the country. Not to mention the banks, the big banks in Canada. These regulations are federal, right? These policies have a direct impact on the ability for Canadians to get mortgages to purchase homes. And on top of all of that, think back to the coordinated COVID response we saw from the federal government and the Bank of Canada. The government who spent generously to prevent pandemic economic scarring, with all that spending made possible by the billions of dollars created out of thin air by the Bank of Canada through their quantitative easing program. And I'm not even saying that these actions weren't warranted or that they were the wrong decisions at the time, but they certainly were a major factor in the rapid surge in housing prices and the inflation that we suffered for years later, even going on to now. And all of this is blame that the government seems to be desperately trying to avoid. And there's all kinds of other demand side federal policy too. We've got the first-time home buyers incentive, the first home savings account, and we've talked about it on the channel before. A major piece of this equation is immigration policy and the unprecedented high immigration targets that have been set just over the past number of years. And it's really wild to consider just how far Canadian sentiment has swung over the past couple of years on this issue. Whereas before, if you expressed any sort of concern about levels of immigration, you'd be immediately labeled as a racist. But now, major trusted news outlets like the Globe and Mail or Reuters, well, they're starting to point out the issue as well. And let me be super clear, nobody is saying that we should halt immigration altogether. We're just questioning what a sustainable immigration rate is. This has nothing to do with race, nationality, or creed of any new Canadian. Canada should be a place that's welcoming to all different types of people. What it does, however, have something to do with is the fact that newcomers and longtime Canadians alike, for both of those groups of people, housing is becoming less and less affordable. Our healthcare system is becoming less and less reliable, and the cost of living is becoming more and more unmanageable. Luckily, just like the housing minister that was fired before him, Sean Fraser, the new housing minister, was previously the minister for immigration just a couple of weeks ago, and he's now moved into this housing role. So if anyone understands this immigration equation, it would likely be that person.
Sean Fraser has demonstrated an ability to manage difficult files and to move forward on ways that really impact Canadians positively. And that's why I'm excited to see him in this new housing and infrastructure file.
But the project before me now is much broader than any one particular group. Everybody in Canada needs housing.
Housing Minister?
Look, it depends what fixing housing means. It's not the same answer to everybody. I think we're going to be able to achieve meaningful progress, and hopefully quickly, to help ensure more Canadians have a roof over their head, and more people who are having trouble getting into the market can think about a place they might be able to own for themselves, can think about being able to afford rent so they can continue to work and live in the communities that they call home. It's not easy, but it's a job worth doing.
New housing starts to struggling though, so how are you going to change that? How are you going to influence policy that will get more houses made?
There's no silver bullet here. We need to look at all the different policy levers we have, and we need to look at the incentives we can create to trigger communities to use the policy levers that they hold.
So that's Sean Fraser, and I think he's a really good communicator, and he's someone who, at least at this point, I think is a good person for this file. I've followed him for a long time as I've been making these videos, from when he was the assistant to the finance minister years ago, to when he became Minister of Immigration, and now he's in this role as the Minister of Housing. And just as a quick aside, I think that this is likely the guy who will be the most likely replacement for Trudeau as the leader of the Liberal Party once Trudeau has left the scene. But in order for Sean Fraser to actually do anything of impact on the housing crisis, it would require an outright statement that what we've been doing just simply hasn't been working. And that would make the Liberal Party look bad, right? Saying, oh, well, the things we have been doing for the past 8 years, well, they're just not going to cut it. So I really question whether or not Sean Fraser will have the sort of free reign over this issue, if it means he would say something bad about the party that he's a part of. So this is the sort of balance he has to walk. He does mention, however, creating incentives for provinces and municipalities to encourage them to build new homes. And that's actually not too far away from the policy of the very person that this Liberal government seems to be worried about, the Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. He's been championing a very similar solution. The only difference is that Pierre is leading with the stick instead of the carrot that the Liberals are leading. Poilievre is saying that he'll take funding away from municipalities and away from provinces if they don't meet mandatory housing start numbers, housing construction goals. Whereas the Liberals are saying, okay, well, you're going to keep your funding, but we'll just give you extra money if you do these certain things that we think will result in more housing being created. And I think that's largely what it comes down to. I don't think any politician, Pierre Poilievre, Trudeau, Sean Fraser, any politician has a silver bullet for solving the housing crisis. But do Canadians want the same sort of nice collaborative federal to provincial relationship, or do they want things to be shaken up and done a little differently?
I think the worst problem is that people can't pay their rent. After 8 years of his inflationary policies, of his shoveling billions of dollars into the bureaucracies that block home building, housing costs are among the worst in the world, nearly double what they are in the United States. Rent has doubled. Mortgage payments doubled. Needed down payments doubled, all after 8 years of Justin Trudeau. Yesterday, he held a press conference to announce in front of a house to tell you all that he's not responsible for housing. That's funny, because 8 years ago, he promised he was going to lower housing costs. It's also funny that the biggest housing agency in Canada, CMHC, is federal. Mortgage insurance, federal. Taxes, fiscal and monetary policy, federal, federal, federal. Immigration, federal. Infrastructure money, federal. All these things are federal, and yet the federal prime minister claims he has nothing to do with it whatsoever. No wonder he wants to wash his hands of his horrendous and unprecedented record. After 8 years, people are losing their homes.
Now, regardless of if Pierre Poilievre's plans would actually make a difference or not, it's certainly clear that he's struck a nerve with many Canadians and has recognized that the cost of living and housing are top of mind for Canadians. And if the current government doesn't make a huge change, doesn't take massive action, it could be a big problem for them by the time the next election comes. So it's going to be super interesting to watch, and I'm curious what you think about all of this. Do you think that Pierre Poilievre's approach is the right one, or maybe the Liberals with under new leadership from Sean Fraser might be able to make a dent? Or have I missed something entirely here? Do you think I'm dead wrong on these issues? That's okay too. Let me know down in the comments what you think about it. I read every single one and I try to get back to as many as I can. And if you haven't already done so, subscribe to the channel. It's one click and it's free, and it helps more Canadians get this type of content and helps me out dramatically. So I appreciate you doing me a solid. And with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.